Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Golden Knowledge Podcast here on YouTube. I'm your host, Pat Voss. I have all the best from atheists to scientists to politicians, athletes, musicians, all over the globe coming on this show to give you, the viewer, a little behind the scenes look, a little behind the curtain look at what they do and either YouTube or what they do in a profession. So today's guest is amazing. I love his channel. It's Godless Engineer. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing pretty good. We're still kind of getting moved into the new house, and which was why I still had the green screen up and everything like that. But it's going pretty good, and I'm pretty stoked to be here.
And with your channel, Godless Engineer, how did you kind of come up with that? Because I know a lot of people say, well, I want to start a YouTube channel, or I know what kind of niche audience that I want to go after. How did you come up with this?
Well, I actually didn't have all of that in mind when I first created it, because when I first created it, I had somewhat recently become an atheist, and I found that my new worldview was getting on the nerves of a bunch of people, like a bunch of family members. And so I decided that I was going to create a Facebook page where I could sort of, show that side of me, I guess, that the rest of my family really didn't want to hear about. So I made a Facebook page, and I used that primarily to comment on other Facebook pages. And I did that as, just a way for me to interact with content I wanted to interact with without having to worry about family members getting upset and unfriending me, which I think about at least two people did that before I created the Facebook page. But anyways, I made the Facebook page, and I started creating memes on it, and I started getting a little bit more recognized in the community and everything. And how I came up with the name was that I wanted to be a little different than everything else that I had been seeing on Facebook at that time, because I really wasn't looking at YouTube. But I wanted to be somewhat different than most people, and so I didn't want to just be an atheist engineer. I wanted to play off of the whole idea that I don't believe in a God, but I didn't want to use atheist. So godless, that came to me. And so I had just finished my master's in software engineering, and so I since I've got 2 degrees in engineering, and that kind of but prior to doing all this activism and everything like that, I was trying to do the sort of freelance software engineer type thing. Like, I still had my main job, but like on the side to keep myself busy, I was doing sort of freelance coding and freelance engineering and stuff. And so I was like, well, godless engineer, that sounds like a pretty good way. So a lot of people think that it's about like me engineering godlessness or something like that, but it's really just very descriptive about myself, because I, one, godless, and two, I'm an engineer. And those were like 2 of my sort of main things at the time when I created the Facebook page that I was really thinking about. And so that's how Godless Engineer came to be. I eventually made my way onto YouTube when on the Facebook page, religious people were commonly saying like, oh, it's easy to say all of this behind a Facebook page, where, you're not showing your face or anything. And so I was like, I can do videos. And, I had already seen a few videos on YouTube from popular creators, and I was like, I can do this. And so I started doing YouTube videos, and it was really sporadic at first. It was really kind of unfocused on my channel, because I wasn't really making content on a regular basis. I was just making content as it came to me. And, at that time I wasn't being paid for anything, like I wasn't making any kind of ad revenue or anything like that. So I just kind of made stuff as it came to me, and I started getting a little bit more serious. And eventually it got to the point where, I got into the partner program, and I was able to, generate money from it. And, that's kind of around about that time I kind of wanted to get a lot more serious with it, started producing content on a daily basis and everything. And that's kind of where we're at today. Just constantly trying to refine things to try to make it more interesting, but I also want to do content that a lot of people aren't going to watch, but I still want to make the content. So it's kind of it's a good balance there.
See, I like the channel when you say, listen, at first, and you're being honest, because a lot of people will say, well, I made this and I had these ideas about it and I had it ready to go. And you're saying, listen, when I first did this, wasn't getting paid. It's not just somewhere where I can make, hundreds of thousands of dollars, because a lot of people coming into YouTube think that's how this works. And so I'm glad that you're at least being honest of how you reached it. And I'm a big fan of your channel, because I think what you do, besides what I do, like aside from what I do, when I interview people, we have discussion topics. You have a discussion topic as well most of the time, but you also have either debunking or rationalizing out something, arguments from other theists or so on. So I'm glad that you have that. What, outside of your channel, what would be the channel that you look up to the most as far as other atheist, either debunkers or channels sort of like your own?
That's a really good question. And I would have to say that the two people that I I guess, gauge myself with and I look up to are going to be Vice Rhino and Paulogia. Both of them are just excellent creators. They have a great way of capturing an audience and keeping people interested in topics, even though they can produce like these really long form videos. People are still just wanting to know, what they have to say about a topic. And so, I mean, I really look up to that, and not just their ability to do that, but also their content in general. Their content in general is really great. And, I take away, things from what they do, and I try to insert it into my own content. Like, one thing that I've tried to do a lot more recently, which I've kind of done this at varying levels, like for a while now, and that's put a lot more, not necessarily because I've always researched my videos pretty well, but putting a lot more visual acknowledgement of like the sources I've consulted, and like not necessarily appealing to those, but sort of exposing people to the sources that I found when I was doing research, for the video, or I was formulating what I wanted to say. I'll try to put those up a little bit more. And for some videos, there's a lot of like references in there, and then for other videos, especially videos where it's concerning just like a defense of atheism as a position in general, or a defense of atheists in general, I don't necessarily have a lot of references for that. It's a lot of like my own thoughts and me working it out in my own head. So I don't really have a lot of that stuff. But when it comes to like a history video, or a more scientific video, like the evolution videos and things of that nature, I generally have a whole lot more references that I can expose people to see, where they can go to get all the information. Not just me, because I don't think people should just trust me and whatever I say. I think that looking at the actual scholarship and the actual scientific evidence is the best thing to do.
One thing I'd noticed, when you were speaking earlier, was talking about when you first started your channel, or you first started doing this, you had pretty newly realized you were an atheist. And I've realized I was an atheist roughly about 16 years ago, about half my life. So I just think that today's subject is very apt. What are the biggest misconceptions you've run into about what atheism is, or what it entails? And can you kind of go into detail a little bit about that, about what you've run into?
Well, a lot of people, like one of the biggest ones, or the biggest pet peeves, is the idea that atheism can only ever mean that you're putting forward a positive claim of God does not exist. And a lot of people want to not acknowledge the fact that there are degrees, and there are different labels that we can put on these different degrees. Like typically the way that I label them is a hard atheist, or a Gnostic atheist, and then agnostic atheist and soft atheist is how they generally do them. And so that provides a little bit more insight, I guess, as far as what you like what your position actually is, because if you're a Gnostic atheist, then you're claiming that you know that God does not exist and you can defend that position. If you're an agnostic atheist, then you don't know if a God exists or not, but you don't believe one to exist. And so it's a little bit of a nuance there that a lot of people don't get, and they will sometimes try to force you into making the positive claim that God in general doesn't exist. But that can even granulate down a little bit farther, because at times I'll say, well, I'm agnostic, or I don't know about a general God, but I'm very Gnostic on specific definitions of God. So that's kind of a way, I guess, I compromise with whoever I'm talking to, because I'm very sure that the God of the Bible, and like the Abrahamic God in general, doesn't exist. There's multiple ways in which I can support that, and I feel confident in my position that, as described in the Bible, or in the Quran, or in the Jewish Bible, that particular God doesn't exist. And so I think that that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions. But then, of course, there's also the crazier misconceptions. I haven't necessarily had this experience, but I know some people who have been likened to, sacrificing small animals, or worshiping Satan and all this other stuff. And so people will actually think that atheist means that you worship Satan, which is kind of crazy to me, because if we don't believe in God exists, then we're not going to believe that Satan exists either. So we're not going to worship him. So I would say that those are probably two of the biggest misconceptions that I've had to deal with.
One of the biggest that I've had to deal with is thinking that because you say you're an atheist, or if I said I was an atheist, they immediately think that, well, then immediately that goes to science, right? I have to believe in science. You believe in the Big Bang. You believe or have faith in all of these other things, supposedly, from the mind of a theist. And again, as a former believer myself, I had some of these ideas in my head prior to realizing I was an atheist. So it's not so uncommon, but I have been accused of, just believing in the Big Bang. And when I ask, what is the Big Bang to you, to the theist, normally they can't give me a solid answer. I have been told it's an explosion, like a dynamite explosion. That is one thing I've been told. Evolution doesn't exist. We were all here at the same time. Dinosaurs and humans roam the planet kind of like Ken Ham style on this planet at the same time. So I've heard quite a few different arguments, and I think that I'm not compelled to just go with science, because science is not an authority figure driven practice. It's the practice in which we're learning through the scientific method how the universe around us works, bit by bit by bit, day by day by day. And I actually have a pinned tweet that says so. It's, if you're not learning something new every day and you're not surprised, I'm surprised if I'm not surprised, right? And that's the mindset I try to lead with, because then if I can have that, I'm trying to then educate everyone else, helping them to hopefully have that mindset. Not that no God exists, but that to have a mindset to utilize critical thinking in every aspect of your life.
Right. If I had to pick like a second popular misconception, is that atheism includes like all of these other scientific principles, because a lot of times religious apologists, they'll confuse science with atheism, like you were saying. And that's probably the second most popular, or well, I guess popular to me. Like that's the second most aggravating kind of misconception about atheism. Atheism isn't the Big Bang, or atheism isn't evolution. It always gets me, because like there are theistic evolutionists out there, and there are theists that accept the inflation of the universe. And so, I mean, it's kind of weird, that kind of position, because it's like, well, what about all these other people that believe in God but also believe in these scientific concepts? And it's like, it's so confusing to me.
Well, one thing that I was going to get at was a misconception about the what you said about Satan worship. If we're worshiping Satan, that we don't believe in Satan, we don't believe in God either. How are we doing that? But also that we're inherently immoral, and that's something that I think the Bible and Abrahamic religious systems adopt, is that someone who doesn't have that cannot be moral. And where do you kind of come at that? How do you come at that?
Just like the argument for morality in general, you mean? Or-
Yes. That religion seems to want to usurp, saying that if you don't have religion or a God figure, you can't be a moral person. You don't know what's the difference between right and wrong.
Right. My favorite version of this comes from Frank Turek, who says that it's not that he believes atheists are immoral or anything like that. It's that they are stealing from God in order to be moral people. They're just not wanting to acknowledge it. I find it kind of odd for people to make any of those kinds of arguments, just because there are plenty of people in different countries that don't believe in the Christian God, but at the same time are moral in their respective societies. And even before Christianity came along, you had various societies that sort of resemble the same moral code that we have now, and in some of the most basic ways, like don't murder your fellow neighbor, don't steal from people, and all this other stuff. Of course, back then it was a lot more ruthless, of a world, but you could see some of the same ideas that are encased in our current moral code. But also, it always astounds me because I guess I focus on what their claim is, and their claim is that you need their God in order to be moral. Or some people even go more generic than that and say, well, you just need to believe in a God in order to be moral or something. But every time I look at a religion, I see that religion has changed its moral code that they claim is absolute or transcendent over hundreds of years. And typically I point to Christianity, because Christianity's changed a lot since its inception in the first century. Just over slavery. I mean, for hundreds of years, slavery was a perfectly fine thing. For thousands of years, slavery was a perfectly fine thing. And then all of a sudden, apparently God's immutable words in the Bible change in a course of like 10 years. It changes from, oh, slavery is okay, and we're going to use the Bible to enslave people, to, oh no, slavery's bad. Come on, guys, God don't like this. And it's gotten to the point now where people like J. Warner Wallace and Frank Turek and just all the popular apologists out there, they all want to try to recontextualize the Bible's slavery into indentured servitude, acting like chattel slavery just didn't exist either in the Bible or in the Israelite community, or the Jewish community that followed right after that. They want to act like it just simply didn't exist and that God never condoned it, when you can point to popular references in the Bible. Like the one that I always go to is Numbers 32, 17 to 18, because that's the story of the genocide of the Midianites, right? And so what happens is that God is really mad at the Midianites because the Midianites and the Israelites were mixing, like they were screwing around with each other. And so God didn't like that. He didn't like a mixing of the races at the time. And so he had Moses, he had them take vengeance on these people by killing everybody. But they didn't kill everybody at first. They saved like all of the women and children. And, of course, Moses and God were really mad that they left the women and children alive. And so Moses was like, okay, listen, kill everybody that you got except for the virgin girls. I swear it's not for sex reasons, okay? And so it becomes this story where you very visibly have the Israelites as an invading force on an otherwise peaceful people group, killing everybody in the town and then stealing young girls to put them into slavery. And it's like, you want to tell me that your book is the only place to find morality, or your God is the only example of morality? Have you read the Bible? Because this is just one passage, and this particular story actually happens another time, and it happens all throughout the Old Testament. I mean, we just recently did a Bible study on the channel where God, what happened was God was using the surrounding people nations, the groups of people, to exact his vengeance on the Israelites, because the Israelites were messing up really bad. And so God wanted to punish them. So, like mercenaries, he contracted all these people out to do his dirty work. Well, after they got done doing his dirty work, he then turns around and punishes them for doing the dirty work that he contracted them to do. And it's like, or is double crossing like your contractors? Like, is that really a moral thing that you want to be putting forth here? Like, it just seems really weird to me that people would point to the Bible as a source of morality when there's so many immoral and unethical things in the Bible.
Well, one thing I noticed that you did say, and I agree with, is changing their minds, right? Especially Christianity as a whole, changing their minds at where their moral values lie based on subjective, morality, subjective, societal norms changing, the people saying, hey, we're not okay with slavery now. We're not okay with rape and murder. So now the Christianity has to change with it. And that's something I see in a lot of fallacies committed by theists in general, is what we like to call the watchmaker argument in some aspects, watchmaker argument, because it commits a fallacy where it's more special pleading at the end of the fallacy. So to break that down a little simpler for people listening or watching, watchmaker argument is basically saying functional complexity, us, the human eye, other animals, the earth and the way that it functions, other, galaxies and how that functions, in the universe as a whole. Functional complexity requires, in their mind, a more complex being or more complex mind in order to create the functional complexity, right? Which is why they call it watchmaker argument. If you find a watch in a desert, you would understand that a watchmaker made it. But of course, that's with other data and understanding how watches are made previously in order to even make that assertion. So the thing they fall into is an infinite regress. And that would be if you can explain the infinite regress of the watchmaker argument about functional complexity.
Well, yeah. So the way that apologists get out of it is by a special pleading argument, but the infinite regress is that, any functionally complex being or intelligent mind that would be needed to create that thing would then need a more complex intelligence in order to create it. And then ad infinitum going back, I mean, it doesn't seem to stop. But like the Abrahamic religions, they have a special pleading argument for that, is that their God is the uncreated, like the eternal thing that's just always existed, from which everything was created. And so he's the Thomas Aquinas called him the prime mover. Of course, Aquinas had this whole idea that everything that is in motion had to, be pushed into motion from something else. And so there's an infinite regress back on who, like, what started things in motion. And so you had to have a prime mover in order to start the motion of the universe. Same concept, just updated a little bit. The infinite regress for the watchmaker argument. But with the watchmaker argument, it fails to account for natural explanations for things. And that's ultimately, at least for me, that's the place that I go to whenever I'm looking to, I guess, argue against it. Because if we have natural explanations for how something happens or how some event occurs, or for, how something came to be, then we don't need supernatural ones. And that's ultimately what it is they're arguing for, is the supernatural intelligence, right? Like, for instance, with the watch on in the sand, obviously watches are made by people, but that's a natural explanation for that. And they then try to compare a watch to a a biological system, like a tree or some kind of animal, us. They try to compare it there, but you see, we have natural explanations for like how we develop. We have a natural explanation for how we gestate. We have a natural explanation for how plants, like the entire life cycle of a plant, we know how that works, and it doesn't require a suspension of the natural order in order for it to happen. And so ultimately, they try to equate two things that are not equatable. They try to equate obviously designed and manufactured things to things that are not designed, not manufactured, and are actually produced by natural processes. If we had a natural process that could explain how a clock came to be, then we would, we would be able to say that, oh, well, obviously this such and such process made the clock, so it didn't need, anything. But a good natural example of this is actually nuclear reactors, because there have been found some natural nuclear type reactors that have developed. And of course, it's not designed by God or anything like that. It's just, it's very rare for them to develop, but they do develop in certain places, and they're very crude, and they don't really produce a lot of energy, but it's because of how they're naturally developed. That right there, while it's similar to the way that our nuclear reactors work now, it's not exactly the same. It's very naturally produced.
One other instance I find is that when you go with the Abrahamic gods, what you're saying is that a God that is sometimes thought of as outside of time and space created this time and space. So, but the difference being that with a watchmaker argument, what a lot of theists don't realize is that the watchmaker to create the watch in the first place is just using already existing elements, reorganizing them in such a way to create a watch, where it doesn't necessarily follow when it comes to a God figure, because when you go to a God figure, then it's out of nothing. It can create anything it wants because it's all powerful and all knowing, right? Or at least all powerful portion of it. So it does kind of fail in that aspect, because if we follow that even to a conclusion, there would have already had to have been something here for this God figure to work with to create what we see as the Big Bang, quantum fluctuation, and inflation, and so on. So that's something that I see as a separate breakdown. What do you see when it comes to the rise in science like quantum mechanics over the last 100 years, and seeing fields like, engineering in general, engineering, biology, chemistry, physics, all of these getting massive overhauls, updates over roughly the last century as new things are discovered? Do you find that theists are now trying to say, I need faith, but I also want evidence and data, and I'm going to point to the scientific findings in order to somehow back up a God belief? Or are they sticking more towards faith still?
Well, no, I mean, I do find that a lot of Christians out there will try to say that their faith is evidence-based and scientifically backed, but typically the science that they use to prove it either includes various logical fallacies or leaps in logic, or they pretty much are using things that they got from like answers in Genesis, or some other institution out there that only strictly employs like creationist type scientists, or very devout Christian type scientists that are doing research in order to prove that God exists rather than finding the truth of reality. And so some people do try to do that. A lot of people out there go for the emotional type of well, I have my faith, like I believe, like I had this experience of the Holy Spirit and all this other stuff, and that's how they know that their God exists, which is perfectly fine. I mean, I don't exactly dunk on those kind of people for having that emotional experience. I do generally question them though, Because I asked them, well, how do you discern that from how like a Muslim feels whenever they pray to their God or the experiences they had? How do you know that it was your God and not their God or something of that nature? I tend to ask questions about that kind of thing because I don't understand how the emotional aspect really can be convincing. Maybe I'm a little bit too analytical to understand it, but I just it's a very unpersuasive argument to me. The ones that I find more interesting are the when they try to back up their belief with scientific evidence, because most of the time if they say, well, I've got scientific empirical evidence that God exists, it's generally not empirical evidence that God exists. And so it's always interesting to hear those, because you always hear something. Well, most of the times you hear the same stuff over and over again, but sometimes you hear something new, and it kind of makes you think. And that's when you go and you research things, and you learn more about them and all this other stuff. So it can be quite interesting when it comes to the scientific evidence for God.
One thing I wanted to kind of close with here is I believe you've been a part of some debates, yes?
A few, yeah.
A few. What would be, out of the debates that you've had, what would be the debate that you would consider the toughest from an oppositional standpoint towards getting, I don't know, having your side win, so to speak, at the end of a debate? What is the toughest opposition you've faced so far?
Oh man, I don't know. It's hard to say. As far, because anytime that I do a debate that's primarily on a religious channel, typically, I mean, I go into it not expecting to win anybody over. I think probably the toughest debate that I was in was actually the one that I did in person here locally. I debated a guy who was down here from Canada. um I can't remember his name right now. I really hate that I can't, but anyways, we were debating about like evolution, and whether or not evolution's true. And of course he was on the opposition side, and me being in North Alabama having a debate at a church, I was definitely going to lose that one. But it was also a lot more difficult because it was in person. It wasn't like streamed online or anything like that. I was a little bit more uncomfortable, being on stage, just because of like, my weight and stuff. I just knew that, people were going to crack jokes about that kind of thing. And so, that was a little bit more difficult, I guess, than the others. Not really the technical aspect of the debate. I feel like I do think that I made some mistakes in the debate, not in like my factual information, but just how I responded to his stuff. But every debate that I have, I always learn something new. I always learn how to do something better or what not to do, and so I try to improve upon that and employ that in any future debates. Um, so uh, so yeah, I'd have to pick that one.
And as we close today for the episode, I wanted to ask two things. Well, one, do you have something upcoming, for your channel, either a podcast episode or a regular episode? What do you have upcoming for your channel there that people can look forward to?
Well, I typically have a lot of things that are going on. So tomorrow, I'm hoping to get my Skeptic Mafia podcast up at some point during the day. That's for the Skeptic Mafia. That's the memberships over on my channel. But on Thursday, I'm going to be responding to a video where the person claims that I should delete my channel. And so they try to make an argument that I'm doing harm in general, and so I should delete my channel. But there's that. But also tomorrow night I'm doing a discussion on the historical Jesus, because if anybody doesn't know me, I'm a mythicist, so I don't think that Jesus existed in history. And I'm going to be having a discussion with a guy tomorrow night on his channel, and so that'll subsequently premiere either Friday or Saturday on my channel. And so, and then Friday nights, we have a live stream that we do. We do a live stream every Friday night, and super chats, and pretty much a portion of all revenue from the channel ends up going to a charity of some kind. So we typically have a lot of fun. We've got fun alerts that go on that people can trigger by doing super chats and stuff like that.
So, and don't worry, guys, if you're listening to this and you want to go back and rewatch that portion of what he has coming up, you feel free, but also don't worry, I have you covered. The link to his channel is in the description below. So I've got you guys. Before I let you go, I have to, because this is one of the things even I find myself doing when I'm watching your channel, is the intros to your videos. Can you give me a quick intro for your videos that you normally do?
Like the what's up, heathens? How y'all doing?
I appreciate
that.
Yeah, absolutely. That is one of my favorites. And I even find myself, and my wife thinks I'm nuts because I'm saying it with you. And I'm like, I love this channel. But of course she's like, well, you can go ahead and dork out on it with another atheist and have fun. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people like the intro. They have a lot of fun with it. I mean, some people say that's a really cringy intro, but I mean,
no, I like it. I like the way you have it. You have it, and you're consistent with it, which I think takes. If anybody wants to say it's cringy, I would say that would take it off out of that ballpark. Only because you are so consistent with it. It's not necessarily like you tried it twice and you're like, okay, screw it, I'm not going to do it anymore. I like that you're consistent.
Yeah.
So guys, this has been another interview special for the Golden Knowledge Podcast here on YouTube. I've been your host, Pat Voss. My guest today, Godless Engineer. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate coming on here and being able to talk to you and your audience there. So appreciate it.
All right, guys, I will see you in the next episode.